1973, life in Britain changed. Prices of agricultural products increased sharply. It cost families more to keep food on the table.
Do you want a sausage, Richard?
It wasn't an accident. A government decision pushed prices up. Britain turned away from cheaper produce from its former colony, Australia. Instead, Britain increased rural output and bought rural commodities from its more expensive European neighbours. But why was that decision made? Was there a gain to compensate the pain? Britain's trading relationship with Australia was bound by the apron strings of empire. The former colony had long supplied food to the plates of Mother England. In 1950, a third of Australia's exports landed in Britain. But in 1973, those apron strings were cut. Britain signed an agreement to join its neighbours in the European Community, or EC. It was formed under the Treaty of Rome in 1957. It would progressively eliminate trade barriers between European countries. Goods could cross borders without trade restrictions. The increased trade would bring economic rewards. Britain couldn't afford to be left out.
It was the political aspect that Britain wanted to be part of this community that was being formed, wanted to influence things from inside rather than being on the outside complaining. People believed that this was a positive thing to do at the time. The economics was something that had to be accepted.
Those economics hit Australian farmers hard. Their traditional trade with Britain ended almost overnight. In joining the EC, Britain had to comply with its Common Agricultural Policy, known as CAP. The CAP set common barriers to agricultural products from outside the European community. Tariffs and quotas raised the cost of non-EC produce. Australian farmers' preferential access to British markets ended. It was shut out as the United Kingdom fell in line with its European partners. British imports of Australian beef fell more than 75%. The 800,000-tonne annual import of Australian wheat stopped completely. Graham Blight heads the Australian Farmers Federation.
We had to go back to square one virtually and say, well, now who are we going to do business with and how are we going to understand them and how will they understand us? So, yes, it was a cultural shock, and our industry suffered a lot during those times in financial terms too, because not only did we lose the market in the UK, we had to then spend money to build up a market somewhere else.
British consumers were also paying the price for the change. Before joining the EC, Britain's food bills had been the cheapest in Europe. The Australian product was efficiently produced and comparatively cheap.
We should keep with our colonies, our pre-colonies, possibly, but keep together as a unit. This is all wrong.
Europe couldn't match Australia's prices. More expensive produce from Europe pushed retail prices up. Dr. David Robertson saw the effects firsthand.
Prices would be shifted up by about 25% on average, and that was going to mean an increase in the cost of living, the CPI index, by something like 3 to 4%.
Britain lost because trade was diverted from a low to high-cost producer. It had to pay more for agricultural goods. But that's only one side of the equation. Trade in manufactured goods from Europe increased significantly. Removing inter-country barriers made them cheaper. Andrew Stokel heads Australia's Centre for International Economics.
There's an enormous growth in that intra-European trade. The trade between members and parties in that bloc has grown enormously. And that has an upward effect on the incomes of those countries. Against that, if they've diverted trade from other low-cost exporters like Australia, Argentina or America, say of grain, well then that tends to retard income. And so it's an empirical question. Does the income expanding effect dominate the income retarding effect?
Prior to joining the EC, that question wasn't so easy for Britain to answer. The debate raged over whether union would be an economic cost or benefit. Much of the focus was on agriculture. Analysis later showed that British consumers and Australian farmers suffered through trade diversion. But for Britain, the trade created with Europe in manufactured goods helped offset the negative effects.
If you view the formation of the trading bloc and what happened on agriculture narrowly, it was probably a minus. If you view it, and it definitely was a minus, if you view it in terms of where Europe has gradually been going as a step towards greater and greater harmonisation, right? And there's been no real evidence of the external barriers to trade rising by Europe, well then that trade bloc's probably been a good thing.
The complex nature of the analysis means there are no hard and fast rules to determine if a bloc is economically good or bad. But an integral factor is what happens to the common external barriers and what effect that has on trade. Even if external barriers don't rise, trade is diverted. But if they do rise, that diversion is accentuated. When Britain joined the EC, British food shoppers and Australian farmers were clear losers. But as Britain found, even if some trade is diverted, trade created by the removal of internal barriers between bloc countries can compensate. It becomes a question of weighing the good against the bad.